The story they tell children today about a foolish boy, magic beans, and a lucky adventure is one of history's greatest deceptions. The truth about Jack and the Beanstalk reaches back 5,000 years to a time before the pyramids rose from Egyptian sand, before the first words of the Bible were written. What you're about to discover is not a fairy tale at all, but an ancient revolutionary manifesto hidden in plain sight, a brutal allegory of class warfare that someone desperately wanted you to forget. The scientific evidence emerged only recently, and it changes everything. Researchers at the Royal Society employed a technique called phylogenetic analysis, the same method used to trace the evolution of species, to examine the linguistic DNA of folk tales. The results were staggering. Jack and the Beanstalk originated not in medieval England, not even in ancient Rome, but in the Proto-Indo-European era, making it between 4,000 and 5,000 years old. But knowing the age of the story is only half the revelation. To understand its true meaning, we have to step back into that vanished world, a world without massive cities, without the kind of kings we'd later recognize, where stories weren't just told for fun, but for survival itself. Picture this ancient world. No cities, no writing, just scattered farming villages where families huddled around fire pits under star-filled skies, unmarred by any artificial light. The storytellers of these communities weren't entertainers. They were the living libraries of their people, the keepers of survival knowledge, wrapped in narrative. When they told the story of the boy who climbed to the sky world, they spoke in a language that would one day fracture into Sanskrit, Greek, Celtic, and Germanic tongues. Each retelling wasn't just entertainment around the evening fire. It was a transmission of coded wisdom about power, about the relationship between those who rule and those who serve, about the audacity required to challenge the order of the world. This tale survived the Bronze Age collapse, the fall of empires, the birth of religions. It endured because it contained a truth too dangerous to speak plainly, but too important to forget. This tale existed before civilization as we know it, passed down through countless generations, fracturing into countless versions in an unbroken chain of oral tradition from Sri Lanka to the tip of Norway. But here's where the historical record becomes deeply disturbing. The Jack you know, the plucky hero who reclaims his father's stolen treasure, never existed in the original story. That character was invented in 1807 by a Victorian writer named Benjamin Tabart, who found the real Jack too dangerous for children's ears. The earliest printed version appeared in 1734 in a pamphlet called Round About Our Coal Fire, and the Jack it describes would horrify modern parents. Imagine a smoky London tavern in the dead of winter, where labourers warm themselves with cheap gin and cheaper entertainment. These pamphlets, crudely printed, sold for pennies, were the underground literature of the working class. They contained bawdy jokes, political satire, and stories that would never grace a respectable drawing room. The Jack Spriggins of this tale wasn't a wide-eyed child, but a grown man of dubious morals. The pamphlet casually mentions that his grandmother and he laid together, a detail so scandalous that later editors literally tore pages from surviving copies rather than preserve it. This wasn't a story for the nursery. It was adult entertainment for people who laughed at crude humour and recognized themselves in Jack's desperate poverty. This Jack climbed that beanstalk with one purpose: to steal from those who had more than him. And when the giant stood in his way, Jack murdered him without a second thought. But Benjamin Tabart couldn't stomach this unruly Jack, so he reached for his quill, and in that moment, the story took a turn that would change everything. Benjamin Tabart conjured a fairy godmother from thin air, a character who never existed in any oral tradition. This convenient deity appears just in time to explain that the giant had murdered Jack's father years ago, that the treasures rightfully belonged to Jack's family. Suddenly, theft became justice, murder became righteous vengeance, the revolutionary became a dutiful son. Tabart wasn't just editing a story, he was conducting ideological warfare. This was the era when Europe trembled at Napoleon's shadow, when the French Revolution's memory still haunted aristocratic nightmares. The ruling classes needed their children to learn obedience, not rebellion. They needed fairy tales that reinforced the divine right of property, not ones that celebrated theft from the wealthy. Tabart's version spread through Victorian nurseries like a vaccination against revolutionary thought, promoted by folklorists like Andrew Lang, who explicitly stated that fairy tales should be improving to the mind of children. The original Jack, the lazy scoundrel, the opportunistic thief, was buried beneath layers of moral justification. For decades, Tabart's polished version reigned supreme, lulling generations into believing Jack was never anything more than a dutiful son with divine permission. But not everyone bought the illusion. By the end of the 19th century, one folklorist would dig through the whitewash and try to drag Jack back to his darker, truer roots. Joseph Jacobs tried to resurrect the truth in 1890. But Jacobs wasn't your typical Victorian gentleman scholar. He was a Jewish Australian immigrant who had witnessed firsthand how the powerful rewrote history to suit their purposes. He didn't collect his stories from other books in Oxford libraries. He walked through the East End slums, sat in workhouses, listened to the stories that actual people told when no respectable person was listening. What he heard appalled his fellow academics. The Jack that working people remembered wasn't noble or justified. He was desperate, cunning, and utterly without morals. Jacobs was openly scornful of Tabart's sanitization, calling it a stupid alteration that destroyed the story's essential character. When he published his version, he deliberately stripped away the fairy godmother, the dead father, the righteous justification. He mentioned that the giant ate stolen oxen and children, yes, but offered no backstory to justify Jack's crimes. His colleagues were horrified. One reviewer called it unsuitable for the innocent. But Jacobs understood something his critics didn't. The original story survived 5,000 years precisely because it wasn't innocent. It was true. Now consider the giant himself, because understanding him unlocks the entire hidden meaning of this tale. The word ogre traces back to Orcus, the Etruscan god of the underworld, a massive, hideous deity with a mouth wide enough to devour souls. The giant's famous chant carries an even more sinister history. Fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman, appears in print as early as 1596, when Thomas Nash noted it was already ancient. Shakespeare knew it. King Lear speaks a version of it while pretending to be mad. But the most chilling revelation came from Charles Mackay in 1877. This scholar of ancient languages was studying Gaelic war songs when he stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. Those seemingly nonsensical syllables, fee, fi, fo, fum, weren't nonsense at all. They were Gaelic, a coherent phrase from a language that predated the Anglo-Saxon invasion of Britain. According to Mackay's translation, the giant is saying, "Behold food, good to eat, sufficient for my hunger." Mackay imagined the original context. Ancient Celtic warriors, their faces painted with woad and ash, standing over the bodies of Saxon invaders. This wasn't a nursery rhyme. It was a cannibal's battle cry, a promise that the invaders would feed the defenders' children. The rhyming of fum with Englishman wasn't coincidence. It was linguistic evidence of an ancient hatred preserved in oral tradition. When parents today cheerfully recite fee, fi, fo, fum to their giggling toddlers, they're unknowingly repeating a phrase that once meant literal consumption of human flesh. The giant's chant is fossilized warfare, a remnant of a time when victors didn't just defeat their enemies, they devoured them. Yet the giant represents something far more sophisticated than a simple monster. Look at where he lives, a castle in the clouds, a realm of abundant wealth floating high above the struggling masses below. Jack's family is so poor they must sell their last cow to avoid starvation, while the giant casually devours multiple calves for breakfast. The symbolism couldn't be clearer. The giant is the aristocracy, the ruling class, the 1% of the ancient world who hoarded wealth while those below scraped for survival. His castle in the sky is every gated community, every ivory tower, every palace built on the backs of the poor. But a giant alone doesn't make the story endure. His power depends on what connects his world to Jack's. the towering beanstalk. More than a ladder, it's the bridge between classes, between realms, between the impossible and the inevitable. And this brings us to the beanstalk itself, not just a magical plant, but one of humanity's oldest and most powerful symbols. Anthropologists call it the cosmic axis, the mythical bridge between worlds that appears in virtually every culture on Earth. It's Jacob's ladder from the Bible. It's the Tower of Babel. It's the world tree of Norse mythology. It's the rope of arrows that Native American shamans climb to reach the sky world. The beanstalk represents the impossible journey from poverty to power, from earth to heaven, from mortality to divinity. But here's what makes Jack's story unique and dangerous. He doesn't climb it to worship. He climbs it to steal. The beans themselves deserve scrutiny. That scene where Jack trades the family cow for 5 beans is always played for comedy. Look at the foolish boy who fell for a magic bean scam. But beans held profound meaning in the ancient world. In Roman funeral rites, beans were thrown into graves to feed the dead. In Egyptian mythology, beans contained the souls of the deceased. The Pythagoreans refused to eat beans, believing they housed human souls. When Jack trades milky white, his family's last source of sustenance, their final connection to a stable life, for these 5 beans, he's not making a foolish trade. He's performing an ancient sacrifice, exchanging the certainty of slow starvation for the possibility of transformation. Now we come to the treasures Jack steals, and here the story reveals its ultimate secret. These aren't random magical items. Each one is a specific tool of power stolen from mythology itself. The golden goose appears simple enough. Endless wealth, golden eggs, forever. But in the Buddhist Jataka tales, written 2,000 years ago, the golden goose is the Bodhisattva himself. Not just any enlightened being, but the future Buddha in animal form. In these stories, the goose possesses perfect wisdom and foresight, warning kingdoms of approaching danger, teaching kings the nature of reality. One tale tells of a golden goose who plucks his own feathers to save a poor family, but when they become greedy and try to pluck all his feathers at once, they turn to ordinary white. The message was clear. Wisdom and enlightenment cannot be seized by force. Except Jack does exactly that. He steals not just wealth, but wisdom itself, the ability to see the future, to understand the hidden workings of the world. He takes by force what mystics spend lifetimes trying to achieve through meditation. The gold coins seem straightforward, until you realize they represent the giants' hoarded wealth, the accumulated riches stolen from generations of common people. Jack is literally taking back what was taken from his class. But the harp changes everything. This isn't just any magical instrument. In Irish mythology, there exists a harp called Uaithne, wielded by the Dagda, the good god, the lord of life and death, the king of the Tuatha De Danann. The Dagda's harp didn't just make music. With the sorrow strain, Goiltry, it could make entire armies weep until they drowned in their own tears. With the joy strain, Giantry, it forced enemies to laugh hysterically until their hearts burst. With the sleep strain, Swantry, it cast kingdoms into comas that lasted centuries. The mythology tells of how the Fomorians, the enemies of the gods, once stole this harp. The Dagda pursued them to their feasting hall and called to his instrument. The harp tore itself from the wall, flying through the air and killing 9 Fomorians as it returned to its master. Then, the Dagda played all 3 strains in succession, first making his enemies weep for all they had lost, then laugh at the absurdity of their ambitions, then finally casting them into sleep so deep they forgot to wake. This is the power Jack steals, not just music, but the ability to control human consciousness itself, to manipulate emotion, to alter perception, to command the very forces that keep society ordered. When Jack steals this harp, when it cries out in alarm as he carries it down the beanstalk, he's not just taking a pretty instrument. He's stealing the tools of social control, the very mechanisms by which the powerful maintain power. The giant's rage makes perfect sense. Jack hasn't just robbed him, he's stolen the means of oppression itself. With the harp in Jack's hands, the spell is broken, the giant's grip on power shattered, And that's the moment the tale reveals its true purpose. Not a child's bedtime story, but a blueprint for rebellion. The genius of this ancient story is how it hides its revolutionary message in the structure of a simple fairy tale. A poor boy discovers a way to reach the realm of the wealthy. He doesn't petition them. He doesn't beg for fairness. He doesn't try to work within their system. He breaks into their house, takes their wealth, steals their wisdom, appropriates their power. And when they try to stop him, he kills them. The beanstalk gets chopped down, not to prevent the giant from following, but to ensure no one else from the upper realm can ever descend to reclaim what was taken. It's the destruction of the very bridge between the classes. Consider the timing of when this story exploded in popularity. In 1734, England was still reeling from the Jacobite uprising. Scottish Highlanders had marched on London itself, and though they'd been defeated, the fear remained. If the descendants of deposed kings could threaten the throne, what might the masses do if properly motivated? The story of Jack, the nobody who toppled a giant, must have resonated in every tavern where men grumbled about the Riot Act and the Black Act that made even gathering in groups a hanging offence. In 1807, when Tabart sanitized the tale, Napoleon had just conquered most of Europe. The man who rose from nothing to crown himself emperor was living proof that the old order could fall. British aristocrats, watching French nobles lose their heads to the guillotine, suddenly needed their fairy tales to teach respect for property rights and the natural order. Tabart's edition of the fairy godmother, who explains the giant deserved death, wasn't just editing, it was counter-revolutionary propaganda disguised as children's literature. By 1890, when Jacobs published his version, London was a powder keg. The match girls' strike had just shown that even the poorest workers could bring industry to its knees. The dock workers were organising. Socialist newspapers were appearing on every corner. The gap between the wealthy factory owners in their sky-high mansions and the workers in their underground slums had never been more visible. Jacobs knew exactly what he was doing when he returned Jack to his original form, a reminder that sometimes the only solution to injustice is to take what you need from those who have too much. But the original story contains no such comfort. The Proto-Indo-European version that existed 5,000 years ago was a tale told by people who understood a fundamental truth. Sometimes the only way to survive is to take what you need from those who have too much. Sometimes the giants must fall. The Real Jack and the Beanstalk is a story about class warfare encoded in mythology. It's about a system so rigged that the only solution is to burn it down. It's about recognizing that the wealthy and powerful aren't gods. They're just giants, and giants can be killed. The magic beans aren't magic at all. They're the revelation that the ladder exists, that the castle in the clouds can be reached, that the treasures hoarded above belong to those suffering below. The original tale, which survived 5 millennia, speaks a truth too dangerous to say directly. The powerful aren't invincible. Their castles can be invaded, their treasures can be taken, and their power can be destroyed. It is not a children's story. It is a 5,000-year-old instruction manual for revolution, a reminder that sometimes all it takes is one desperate person willing to climb.